everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. Welcome to the new regulatory landscape webinar series. I'm going to give just a minute or so to let a few more people dial in. We're seeing quite a few attendees still enrolling, so give us a minute or so and then we'll get started. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I always like to reward the folks who arrived on time or early. And we're going to get you guys out of here on time. If anybody arrives late, we will make the recording available for you later. So good morning or good afternoon. Welcome again to the new regulatory landscape webinar series. Today we're covering year-end payroll taxes, balancing the work, and because it's 2020, also supporting your team remotely. Next slide, please. Okay, welcome. I'm Summer Paletti, VP of Sales for Tax and Compliance at Assure PTM. I'm going to be your host today and your moderator. And with me, she allowed me to wrestle her away from her work for 1 extra hour to give you guys some of her expertise and her knowledge. Kelly Gonzalez, our Tax Filing and Compliance Manager here at Assure PTM, is going to join me once again. So thank you, Kelly. Always great to have you.
It is my pleasure, as always.
Wonderful. Next slide, please. So what we're going to cover today is how to prepare for year-end, creating a plan, rebalancing remote versus in-office duties, supporting and managing your team remotely. Now, I want to cover something real quick. We have a mixed audience here today. We've got some folks working for tenured service bureaus. You know, maybe this is your 25th year end. And then we've also got some folks on the line for whom this will be their first or second year end. I definitely remember when I had my first year end, I didn't know what on God's green earth I was doing. And then my second year end came around and I was like, oh my God, I still don't know anything. So unless you've got like 3 under your belt, you know, it feels like a learning curve every single time. So we're going to try to present some balanced information. It'll be a little heavy on some basics, but we'll also chime in with some more advanced level tips for those of you for whom this might not be new. We're doing it a little bit differently. If you guys have attended our webinars in the past, we've gone heavy on the PowerPoint. What we're doing today is a bit more conversational with Kelly's going to give us some tips. We're both going to share some war stories, and then we have created a handout that we'll reference, but you can also download it in the webinar in the handout area. So without further ado, let's get started. Next slide, please. Okay, first we're going to start with how to prepare, with the early preparation being the key to success. And here at Assure PTM, we start preparing like the first week of February for year end. While all of the bad stuff is fresh in your mind, I know it's super tempting to get into all of the items that you pushed off because it's year end. You know, you have a huge to-do list, but we do a debrief and we start prepping for next year end. You know, it's kind of under the theme of let's make sure next year end isn't as terrible or something like that, never again. So what we like to tell you is that if you're talking about preparing for year end in November, you're already too late. But we'll talk a little bit about how you can make the best of it right now. So go ahead, next slide, please. So I joked and said that if you're preparing now, it's too late, but it's never too late to prepare. So here's where I'm going to open it up to Kelly and have her share her expertise a little bit. So what we've prepared for you is a sample checklist, and we'll talk a little bit about what types of things can go on your checklist in order to make sure that you're covering everything you need to cover for your clients. So Kelly, why don't you take it away and give us some tips here?
Sure. Well, I mean, like Summer said, that if you're starting to just now look at your year-end work and what you have in front of you, you're probably a little bit behind the 8 ball, so you're probably going to need to work pretty fast. One thing that you want to do to start off with is looking at your employee information, because that is really what's going to be on all your filing. So when it comes to filing, you need to have correct Social Security numbers. If you don't have them by now, you need to get out there and try to get the correct Social Security numbers, because that is going to be on your W-2s. It's going to be a lot of your W-2 filing with your state information. And if you don't have good W-2s, you're going to be looking at a lot of inquiries and notices coming from government. And you're also going to be looking at balances when you file your year-end work. So missing Social Security numbers. Make sure you have updated employee addresses. You really need to campaign that out to your employees, because when you send your W-2s, you want them to go to the correct address and be received the first time instead of having a lot of that returned to you. And another thing, too, is making sure your names are in the correct format. A lot of agencies, when you're doing filing, especially electronic filing, don't like little hyphens and they don't like dashes. So you need to be very aware of how you've entered it into your payroll system and how it's going to translate into your electronic filing. Another big, huge piece of year end is making sure you're balanced. On our checklist, we go through a lot of, just real quick sample things that you should be looking at. But obviously, you need to schedule your bonus payrolls. You also need to schedule your adjustment payrolls, so that you have those out on the calendar and you have a time frame of when you're collecting your data and you're going to actually be processing it so it posts to your files. You need to look at your negative quarter and year-to-date fields. All of these little balancing pieces on your employee information, your quarter date accumulators, your year date accumulators, you need to make sure that everything ties together, that you don't have negatives, and that everything is balancing to your returns that you filed for the quarters. Your year to date totals are accurate. As you continue balancing, you can look at your register totals to balance to your W-3s. Make sure that your W-2s match your state and local report totals. So there's a lot of balancing that you need to go through, and we kind of list a lot of it out on this checklist that's in the handout. One thing that I can tell you from one of my own mistake stories is I had a year where I inadvertently forgot to put in the amendments that I filed for the year. So my totals were off, and it took me a little bit of time to figure out why I was off, because I didn't incorporate those amendment totals in. So my 4 quarters was not balancing to my year-to-date figures. So that's some of the little things that as you're balancing, you need to kind of be aware of, like, what did I do this year that could possibly impact these totals? So beyond your year-end balancing, once you're balanced and you think everything's great, then you got to process it all. So on our checklist for your year-end processing, the first thing that I usually do, and I start probably around first quarter, and sometimes it's going to be a little scary because you got to look at the calendar, and you're looking at way into the future into, your December, January dates. And it can be a little scary because you're hoping that, things fall on the right dates, things don't fall on the weekends, that all of the weeks fall so that it's in your benefit for filing. But you got to start working on your calendars. I like to work backwards. So I will look at what are my due dates and then work backwards and make sure that all of the things that I need to do in order to file on time with accurate and timely filing, I back into it so that I know that on Wednesday of the day before the due date, everything is filed, everything's balanced. So you want to start with the calendar. One thing that a lot of people forget, and I can sit here and talk stories all day long, is make sure you look at your supplies. Make sure you have paper. Make sure you have paper clips. Make sure you have staples. I mean, it can be the smallest thing, but when you're down to printing, 1,000+ returns or 1,000+ W-2s or even more, and you realize that you have no paper, it's not a fun experience. So those are those last minute runs to Staples and trying to get paper or ink. Ink is the worst when you run out of ink. So look at your supplies. Make sure that you're ready to go. Make sure you have the employee and the staffing to accommodate all of the extra work. You are going into December, and it's a fourth quarter filing and year-end filing. So you're basically doubling up on everything that you're doing. So you really need to make sure that your workforce is going to handle all of the extra work that you're walking into. A couple things that you want to do with your processing is make sure that you test all of your filings, the generation, especially if you're working with states that may have had changes, especially this year. With all of the changes we've had with the COVID-19, you really want to make sure that everything is flowing correctly through your payroll system into your tax filing system and that the output is what you expect. The other thing is you need to make sure that you're testing. You can test with the SSA for your W-2 file submission. You want to make sure that you don't want to wait till the last minute. And I've done this as well. You think everything is fine, and maybe the agency has changed or updated a small piece of the filing, and now your file is completely out of the format, and you're at the 11th hour. It's 3 days before the filing due date, and you have to reprogram your entire file. So you really want to make sure that you're kind of looking at some of your bigger files, testing the format, and making sure that everything will be uploaded correctly. So that's a lot of the processing, and again, it's on that handout. And then really the biggest piece is while you're in year end and you've got 3 million things coming at you, you also need to start thinking about what's happening in the new year. Because you're going to be running your end of year payrolls as they coincide with your first year payroll. So you need to make sure that you have cleared your accumulators. You need to make sure that you have updated your pay codes, updated your tax codes, incorporated new tax codes, and you need to make sure that everything's hitting the right bucket. You need to make sure that you've obtained all your new W-4s, all your new W-5s. You need to remove any tax blocks that you have on your employees. So you need to do a lot of preparation for the new year. And unfortunately, while you're doing all this prep work, you're also filing. So it's a really, really difficult time management issue that you're going to have. So having a calendar and everything documented out so that you can really stay on top of things is extremely crucial for this period of time. And the last thing that I would say is that you really need to work off of setting up yourself for the new year as best as possible. So you really need to be careful that you're not commingling any of your year-end data with your new year data. I can tell you one of my worst horror stories that I've had is where we, at one point, when I was on the payroll side of things, we were entering manual checks into our new year tax. And so all of the checks that should have been for the prior year were entered into the new year and put into the system and processed, and we paid taxes on those. So it was a huge mess because then we had to pull all that back, put it into the right year, And unfortunately, some of those checks didn't get voided. And a year later, when we came to that year end, we were issuing W-2 for employees that didn't work for that year. So you really have to make sure that you're keeping everything separate. And you really need to sit down and take the time to map all of this out for yourself right now before you get into it, because you will definitely forget something. So those are my 2 cents on your checklist, and that's a lot. But I mean, if you just try to
that is a lot. Yeah, well, and I think what stands out to me most is keeping everything organized and segregated from one year to the next, when half of us on the phone are probably also homeschooling kids right now. So there's a lot of segregating of duties right now. You know, spreadsheets help, calendars help. You know, and then if there's ever anybody who needs a little help, just, you know, if you want some extra tips, I'm not trying to sell you anything here, but if you want some extra tips, you know, feel free to reach out and we can go into a deeper dive, or go into your network. You know, if you're a newer provider and this is one of your first year ends, you probably know somebody who's been through it quite a bit, and you can trade notes with them. So I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you, Kelly.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to go into creating a plan, including internal and client-facing deliverables, and then making sure there are deadlines attached to each. So I'm going to lead in with a little bit of a horror story. This is back when I was new with PTM. We had a client, a mid-sized bureau, 150 clients or so, turn in the year-end files on the 28th of January. And did not give us a whole lot of time. I think I didn't see a lot of my family that week. But it was like, we figured that there needed to be deadlines, and I talked a little bit about this in the webinar that we did as part of C3 recently. It's not popular, but if you attach a monetary penalty or something like that, the likelihood that your client will follow the deadline is probably, you know, higher, because we actually had deadlines and, you know, the data was turned in 2 weeks late. So we started enforcing a penalty, and the next year we didn't have any late files of any large amount. So deadlines are key, of course, and deadlines for clients as well. So go ahead and next slide. We're ready to get into some details. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about internal planning and then also client-facing planning. So the internal planning is to make sure that you provide training to your employees. I talked a little bit about, you know, I think that if you're an employee in payroll, you have to go through 2 year ends in order to be kind of a pro. So if you've had some turnover or anything like that, it's a good idea to refresh training. I remember having to do this when I worked for a large national payroll provider. We did year-end training, we did FUTA training, you know, things like that. And there were some of the tenured folks that would come into the training room grumbling that they had to go through multi-state 940 and FUTA training every year, but there's always some people who can benefit. And then, you know, what we did to make that a little bit more fun was to hand out candy. You know, people knew that you grumble and you've been to that training 10 times, but you know, there's donuts or there's candy or there's, you answer a question and you get a prize, you know, things like that. You can try to make it fun. A little bit challenging with Zoom. So, you know, but there's always virtual Starbucks cards or things like that that you can hand out to employees. So, Kelly, do you have anything that you'd like to tell us about internal prep?
Well, yeah, sure. The internal preparation that my team and I, we overly communicate. That's just my nature and my style with my team. So we start talking about, well, we started talking a lot about how we're going to be processing the quarter end, what our internal deadlines are. We also talk our team right now, we have assigned states. So what's happening in Connecticut may not be something that's happening in Washington, but as a team, we like to share the new kind of filing requirements or new family leave issues that are coming out. So we overly communicate with each other. I think that it's a way that we kind of share the pain with each other because we don't want to think that we all have perfect states and everything's wonderful. We want to, and I think that it's kind of gotten to a point with the team that they like to find who has the worst or the more complex and the more confusing filings, and it's almost like an internal game as to who's got it the worst kind of thing. So we talk a lot about that because, for instance, when DC came out with their family leave in Washington and then Massachusetts followed, we really thought it was going to be very similar, and then Massachusetts threw us for a loop and said, well, we're not going to use SUI, we're going to use state withholding. So then that started kind of an internal conversation. So we like to talk a lot. We like to talk about where we are planning-wise. We need to know, okay, we've got some early filing states, how we're going to accommodate that, who's coming in to do the print jobs, who's coming in to, when are we going to get the checks, when are we going to send the EFTs. So we overly communicate. We have a calendar. We did move our office, so I no longer have this great big wall that I used to have where we used to write things down. So now that's more of a daily, especially working virtually and remotely from them. We do that on a daily basis. So my biggest thing when it comes to planning is to communicate and overly communicate, because I know my team, they may not read my entire email, but they can never say that I didn't tell them. So that's one of the biggest things that we try to get through. And then, just making sure that everybody understands what the deadlines are, what's happening on the weekends, if anything's happening, if anything's going to be out of the office. So we just try to keep everybody abreast of everything. And then we have filing guides that control the deadlines. So if anybody from any other team were to ask us about a certain state that may not be assigned to us, we can answer those questions. We can tell them where people are at. And we keep abreast of where we are with filing so that if anybody is behind or needs help, that we can always jump in and help them.
Awesome. And that reminds me of, anybody on here who is an Assure client. If you didn't catch the multi-state webinar that we did for C3, I mean, I delivered it, but a lot of intel came from Kelly. We talked a little bit about an agency filing matrix. We're referring to that. So if you caught that webinar, go, or if you didn't, I'm sorry, go check it out, because we went into a couple more details about what type of things you might want to track. So that's a lot for internal. I'm still laughing over, horror stories, and I guess the prize goes to the person who has the worst thing to deal with. That sounds so much like a payroll pro. So let's see. So then you also have to plan client-facing, and as difficult as it can be to plan things internally, planning things client-facing is even a little bit more challenging. So what we're going to look for is providing instructions to clients in engaging formats. And what I've noticed in years prior to 2020, where everybody's working from home and homeschooling while they're filing payroll, is that you have to provide it in multiple different ways and also at multiple different times. So what we're looking for is to avoid the client, and these are all little snippets of things clients blamed on me along the way. I didn't read that instruction because the newsletter was too long and it was on the last page, so it's not my fault. You sent the calendar too early and I lost it, so it's not my fault for missing the deadline. I was too busy to attend training, so it's not my fault that I did something wrong. I didn't see the email you sent, so it's not my fault. And then also, isn't that what I pay you for, which is the favorite excuse, it seems, of most payroll clients. So we would recommend some small videos, maybe some webinars like this, a newsletter, I know, blogs, training sessions, emails, and whatever you think you've done, assume that you haven't done enough and that your client's going to make a mistake and that they're going to figure out some reason why it's your fault. So just try to cover your you-know-what with your client-facing preparation for year-end. So not to take up too much time because we want to talk about remote work and stuff. Do you have anything to add to this, Kelly?
Well, I think that I get that we, as a service bureau and as a tax filing service, that there's information that's sent out, and we try to edit it down so that it's not a huge document. But I think that anything that you, especially at year end, if you're receiving things, it might be a good idea to skim through it and look at dates, and really try to make those deadlines. We don't arbitrarily put deadlines out there. So when we submit something to our client, then we're requesting data to be completed at by a certain date or time. It's because we've backed into that date. And in order to be successful with our filing and to make it timely and to, allow for any type of issues that may arise, we've backed into that date, so we really need you to make that deadline. All of the information, like if you're sending information out to clients, maybe it's helpful to put the deadlines on that cover sheet. That's what we try to do with some of our documentation is we put all the deadlines out first, and then we kind of get into some of the more wordy explanations of those deadlines. This way that they can look at that. We put that in a Word document, and then we also have it on a calendar. So for those people that are more visual and need that, having the calendar available along with that document helps a lot.
That's a good one. I like the deadlines being front and center and then presenting the information in a couple of different ways to make it easier for everybody to consume. That is awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Next slide, please. All right. So what we're assuming is that everybody has by now created some sort of COVID plan. If you don't have a COVID plan that is written into your HR plan, I would strongly recommend that you seek out the assistance of an HR professional, kind of like your anti-bullying or anti-harassment plan. It's certainly a good idea to have your COVID plan just to cover your business. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to think about year end under the lens of COVID, because, going on my theory that you have to go through a couple of year ends in order to really have it down pat, we've never gone through a COVID year end yet. So whatever process you have for year end probably needs to be reviewed and probably amended in order to take into consideration the new way that we're working. And just to make year end more fun, most states just went back into some form of lockdown. So it's March again, basically. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So you've probably already done this, but what we're tasking you to do is to reevaluate the working arrangement you have, thinking about year end. So you're going to have more duties that have to be done in the office versus remotely. So you're going to have to figure out what those duties are, figure out who needs to do them, and then planning an employee schedule for the work that needs to be done in the office. Again, you're going to have a heavier workload. You're going to have more stuff that needs to be done in the office, but you're going to have to figure out a way to get it done while still keeping those employees safe and not having too many handoffs and not having too many people gathered in the office at the same time. So what I want to do is pause real quick here and ask Kelly for some tips. We process 15,000 clients, give or take. So, we're used to a pretty busy, any day is busy. So what kind of things are your team doing, Kelly, to kind of get everything done, but in a safe, we can't talk to each other in person way anymore?
Right. Well, yeah, they still talk. They're a little bit louder, and we actually are, we have our periodics that we have to deal with as well, which are the periodic coupons that have to go out. So everybody, as we've worked remotely and as a team, we decided to rotate our schedule. So everybody is assigned a day or 2 days during the week, and they go in and they handle the mail and the periodic coupons. During quarter end, what we experienced was we were still rotating schedules, but a lot of them were in the office a little bit more. But we were kind of going in the office, getting things done, and then going home to work remotely. So we had taken some time to look at our schedules, look at our workload to see what is electronic and what is paper. So we were able to kind of rotate our schedules to where, let's say that I was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I was going to do all of my electronic filing, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays, I was going to go in and work on my paper. So this way it allowed them to concentrate strictly on their electronic filings or their paper filings. When they were in the office and they were printing, they had the sole access to the printer or printers, because we have multiple printers. So they were allowed to go in there and print all of their data without being interrupted. We all know how frustrating it is when you're printing, let's say Rhode Island state withholding, and you've got 200 returns that you're printing off, and as you're going through it, you don't want to have to go through it besides regular audit and to find a coupon that somebody printed from home for Delaware. So we were very clear, and we communicated with each other that on such and such date, so and so is going to be printing, and everybody had to hold off on their printing until we were allowed to, or they told us that they were done with their printing. And this way, no little pieces of paper or anything else was commingled with the print job that we were running. And it actually made it work a little bit better than all of us being in the office and all of us printing or trying to get everything done, print jobs. So it was just a matter of organizing how we did quarter end, and now it'll be year end, a little bit different than the norm. So we kind of dissected it and just kind of kept on each other about who was doing what. If we had something that we had to print and it was an emergency or we had to get it out or something happened and we weren't the ones that were physically in the office, we would just communicate to the team member in the office and say, hey, I'm going to print this off. Can you go ahead and put this with A, B, or C and mail it out to the agency for me today? And that's kind of how we went through a lot of the working remotely and working in the office. As we got closer to crunch time and all the due dates, we were in the office. We were, of course, trying to stay away from each other. One thing is we used my work area as kind of the hub of where things were. So we had a lot of plastic bins. We had a lot of notes on data. We had this way, whatever was in this bucket, we knew had to go out on what day, and it was New York Metro Tax, or we just had everything kind of out and about so that we could visually see where we were at. And as our paper started dwindling down and as we started marking off all of our electronic filing, you could kind of see a rhythm, and we could see that we were getting close to the deadline and that we didn't have that much paper in the office, so we were on schedule. And I think that helped us a lot for our own team morale, because working remotely and coming in the office, sometimes you're not sure where everybody is with their filing, and you could start to feel a little overwhelmed, because if you hadn't done 10 filings and your partner over here is done, you start thinking that you're behind. So it was a very it was kind of a seamless process, and it worked out well. So we started that actually first quarter, because it all kind of started working with the remote at that time, and I think we're learning things and we're getting a lot better. But I think the biggest thing was dedicating the print day to individuals so they can print all theirs and not worry about getting paper commingled, and then just keeping track of their electronic filing. I keep I keep a master spreadsheet so I can see, and they report to me when they're done with some of the filings. We also send rejections out to the operations, so I can see where my entire team is with the filings, and I mark them off to kind of see the progress. So if I haven't seen any movement on Pennsylvania locals, then I'll start questioning that, because that's a big process, and if I'm not seeing some movement, then I start getting a little scared. So that's something that kind of have to, working with the individuals in the office and remotely, you have to just kind of stay on top of everything so that there aren't any surprises.
Sure, sure. And you came up with something that I hadn't even really thought of, which is the print jobs. When you're in the office, I guess you take it for granted that you can hear the printer humming along and you can't sneak something in then. But if you're working from home, you don't know that. That's why it's a good idea to break down the entire process and rebuild it again under a COVID lens. So I appreciate those tips. I learned something new today. So then also, it's tough. Year end is tough. COVID is tough. COVID year end is probably going to be tough. We'd encourage everybody, if you're not doing so, bring lunch into the office. It's got to be a prepackaged item. I'd also recommend that you don't forget about the remote guys. I worked for PTM supporting a remote team for a long time when most of the employees were in office, and we found that nobody ever really thought about the remote guys. There would be donuts in the conference room or a quarter-end lunch or pizza or whatever, and the remote guys would hear about it, and there's some FOMO there. So it's actually easier now. I think this is one of the things that makes life easier during COVID is you can do some DoorDash or something, and you give everybody the ability to order. And then the folks who are at home, they can order as well, and then they're not left out. So next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit more about not leaving the remote guys out. The remote work culture matters. I'm hearing a lot of people struggle with this, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up for questions about how to create a supportive environment. I remember somebody years ago, and I don't often brag about myself, but I'm going to do a little bit. He asked me how on earth I created such a cohesive team when all of them were remote. By the time COVID hit, our team was totally used to just being at home in your Nikes all day long. But we try to have fun when we can. So we'll talk a little bit about that for anybody who's new to managing a remote team. Next slide, please. So here's what I see a lot of. I think that in April, there was 1,000 times more Zoom meetings than there are now, but I still see a ton of Zoom, Zoom fatigue is real. And I could go into all sorts of reasons why, but we don't have time for that today. If anyone wants to talk to me a little bit just separately about managing a remote team, I'm open to do so. But the Zoom meetings are actually more taxing to employees than an in-person meeting. And the attention span for an online meeting is less than the attention span for a standard in-person meeting. So when we first moved to Zoom, it was like, well, we used to meet in the conference room for an hour, so now we'll meet on Zoom for an hour. The average attention span for an online meeting is 38 minutes and 17 seconds. No idea where they got that 17 seconds from, but if you're doing an hour-long meeting over Zoom, you're already 20 minutes over somebody's attention span. So consider shorter meetings, consider cameras optional, and then also everyone has seen the meme about this meeting could have been an email. Well, I'm going to attach that to Zoom. This Zoom meeting could have been an email. So look and see if it actually does need to be a Zoom meeting. And I put this on here because I'm still hearing a lot of managers and business leaders asking me things like, well, how do you know your employees are actually working? And those are the words they use, so that's why it's in quotes. So I'm going to task everybody to focus more on things that they can accomplish. Focus on the results. If you have projects that you give them or work and you can see that it's been completed, they're working. It does not create a warm, fun environment if you are doing a lot of Zoom meetings, or you're asking them on Teams and messaging them and emailing them, calling all the time, asking them where they are with something, give them work to do, follow up if they haven't done it, but give them a bit of a leash. If you can't trust your employee, then you probably have the wrong employee on your team. And it's not so much the working remotely, but maybe just getting the right people in the room. Excuse me. I seem to have found a little cough right now. So go right ahead. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to open up not just for questions, but because we have a mixed audience on the line here, I would like to ask, you can put it in the question box and then we'll read it. Anybody who's here who is a tenured payroll pro, or you're running a bureau where you've done this for 10, 15, 20 plus years and you have a tip, put it in the question box and we'll read it. And then if you're newer and you have a question for either Kelly or I, or we can also put it out to the audience, feel free, ask a question. So it's a twofer. Put tips or questions in the question box. And then while we're waiting for those to filter in, I'm going to remind everybody of the handout. In the handout tab, you have, Kelly was nice enough to create for us a sample checklist based upon some of our work. It might be a little overkill if you're not in all 50 states with thousands of locals or things like that, but feel free to use it as a starting point for your own checklist. If you need one, you can also look at it and borrow some stuff from there if there's items that we're doing that you're not currently doing. Well, Kelly, golly, I'm putting you on the spot here, but I know you have tons of war stories. While we're waiting for questions or tips from our audience, I'd like to fill the dead air with, you've got tips that are wrapped up in funny war stories. So give us something that you wrote down in preparation that we didn't have time to go through.
Oh, well, I've got a few. I would say one of the more recent experiences, I'll say, and I think because our team communicates so well, it wasn't that big of a hardship. But recently, we had an individual in our department have a personal emergency at quarter end, and it was a little surprising and shocking at first, and that they had to leave. And so we had to absorb their workload. And luckily, because we have put things in place to kind of track where we're at with our filings, it wasn't so hard to find out where they were with their filing. If it's, if this file had been uploaded and we're just waiting for confirmation, or if this file hadn't even been started. So it wasn't as difficult as I think it would have been if we didn't have that communication in place. But that's one thing that I will say that, things happen. People, they win the lotto and they take off. People have personal issues, and, things come and go. It's life. So anything that you can attempt to kind of get ahead of, or at least, have some type of idea with the communication of where people are at, so that you're not too surprised, or it's not putting you in such a horrible way that, it's a burden and you can't file. Or you're, especially, luckily with our backup and our procedures and how we run as a department, I was able to kind of see if files have been created, if confirmations have been received, and go through and confirm what had been filed and what hadn't been filed and what was outstanding. And that really helped us avoid any duplicate filing or any misfiling. So that's one thing I would say, is that just make sure that you're keeping abreast of where your employees are and your staff is, and where you are with quarter end, year end process, because you just never know.
I think that's great. And if we're filtering everything through COVID year end, you never know Now, if somebody thinks they've been exposed, they have to go quarantine for a couple of weeks. So, I'd rather that somebody wins the lottery in the middle of January, but Okay,
Yeah.
so we have an audience tip, and this is something that's really cool. I would never have thought of this in a million years. So someone wrote, I have quite a bit of documentation in our Password Keeper program regarding how to file and pay each return by state for withholding unemployment annuals, so anyone can step in and produce as needed. So that's super clever to use something like my brain is having we'll call it a senior moment or a blonde moment. What is the password program that we use, Kelly? It's like gone.
Yes. Oh, you know what? I'm going to have to bring it up. It's no. See, now you've just shared your senior moment with me.
It's okay. We don't need to do a commercial for them. Everybody knows who they are. That's because you're going to have passwords for some of those online filings. That's a great one. Thank you for sharing that. This is what we were hoping for, is to get a little bit of tips from the audience.
It is. That is great. And we, as our department, we have. Thank you, Hiroko. It's LastPass, by the way. She just.
Thank you, LastPass. There we go.
But we also, that's one thing that we did a couple of years ago, was we did all of our filing instructions, so that if something were to happen, we can go to the backup and we can, there's screenshots, there's pictures, and there's, some instructions, so that if we did have to jump in and file for a state that we're not familiar with, we have all that backup. But the passwords, I mean, that's great. And, any type of backup that you can keep and, have out there for departments in case, like we said, you win the lotto, is absolutely important for the entire department. So that's a great tip.
Sure. And for this year especially, I know that we always recommend that you file a little early just in case there's errors. I think that when we're looking at year end through a COVID lens, we have backing into due dates and making sure that we can file a minimum of like a week before the actual due date, just in case one of the COVID codes falls out or you get a rejection or something like that, so that you have time to course correct before things are late.
Exactly. And you also need to take in consideration, too, with some states, you definitely don't want to file the day before or the day of the due date, because sometimes they take a little while to process. So there's a few that, you need to file 5 days prior just in order to get the confirmation number and to make sure the filing was successful before that date. So that's another thing when you're working with your calendar, to look at your states that you're in and how quickly they turn around your files that you upload.
Absolutely. And it's always good to remember. I think we're going to end a little bit early, since we've already gone 10 minutes over people's ability to pay attention to an online meeting. I had one last reminder, and I forgot. So there's my senior moment again. So we'll let everybody go. If I have, if you have anything you want to ask, either managing a remote team or managing remote taxes or multi-state taxes or anything like that, feel free to reach out to us. Next slide, and we'll wrap it up. Okay, so that's a wrap. We've been doing the New Regulatory Landscape webinar series since March, April-ish, and we're done. Nobody's going to pay attention to a webinar while they're actually prepping for and doing year end. So in the survey that we send out, we are looking for ideas for 2021 webinars. Some of the most successful webinars we did this year were audience ideas. So we'd like to hear from you guys. And that's it. Thank you for attending. We always appreciate when we have an audience and when we can provide some tips. And we hope everybody has a safe holiday season and a trouble-free year end.